Okay, Thursday morning, zooming in here from Baltimore. We're going to do a quick review of a few technical um, and literary points from chapter 44, which I'll just give a little short summary of. And then we have a short chapter, but important chapter in chapter 45, only 5 verses, and it appears chronologically out of place. Therefore, we have to try to understand why it was placed here and what its purpose is. But let's remind ourselves chapter 44 was a very difficult chapter. I mentioned that both Rabbi Alex Israel and Rabbi David Silber in their podcasts on the Project 929 um, website call this one of the most astonishing, um, disturbing chapters of the Tanach from the perspective of human beings' behavior, because it's the chapter in which ultimately, with the remnant of the Israelites having chosen and the Judeans having chosen to go down to Egypt, Jeremiah communicates with them there. We have the sense that they've already spread out. Some number of years have passed since 586 BCE. They've already spread out across the land of Egypt. They've seen that Judea is in ruins, and a message from God comes through Jeremiah to essentially say, because you didn't listen after all my attempts, I destroyed Judah and Jerusalem, and why don't you turn back and follow the teachings that I have taught you, and not worship the gods of the Egyptians. And the shocking, although again, as I said last week, it shouldn't take us too much by surprise, given what we know about the way the stories are told of the people of this time and maybe of all times. But still, the brazenness really strikes you right in the face, which is that the answer, and we also noted the kind of significant presence of women's voices in this chapter. The answer from the women and the men was, we're not going to listen to you. Einenu shomim elecha, right? This is something which we already know is true. The people don't listen, but it's rare that they actually just say, we're not going to listen, just quite explicit and direct. And in fact, on the contrary, we're going to offer all of our offerings to the Queen of Heaven and pour out libations to her, because the truth is that things were great for us back in the days before the religious reforms of Josiah. Things were great for us when we worshiped the Queen of Heaven, whoever exactly that was. And ever since we stopped worshiping the Queen of Heaven, everything has been going poorly for us. And therefore, our conclusion is that worshiping other gods is good, and we're going to continue to do it. And Jeremiah essentially has nothing to say, and so he more or less just repeats himself and says, you've confirmed your absolute rejection of God, and you will be punished here in Egypt, just like you were punished in the land of Judea. Don't think that this will, that having come here will provide you any safety or security. And when we read chapter 45, the chapter that follows, we'll sort of see that no new information comes there. And therefore, in essence, this is Jeremiah's last prophecy, his last word, and to a great degree, kind of almost the close of the story of the Jewish people in the Tanakh. Obviously, we have in Ezra and Nehemiah a little bit of the beginning of the return, but this is kind of the death knell and the end of the first Commonwealth and of the Jewish community, of Judea, now exiled to Egypt, and only the small remnant which remains. So I want to share my screen just to go back to the text and notice a couple of things. That was a long chapter in chapter 44, just to point out a few textual notes before we go on to chapter 45. One of the things that's significant is that the idol worship rarely uses the words, in Dvarim, it's mostly, la'avod Elohim acherim, to serve other gods. Here we very specifically have this root over and over of kater, to make offerings, seeming from the language of ketoret, frankincense or incense, and in particular, kitol is a sense of smoke, a kind of fire, probably an incense offering a spice offering that's burned up and produces smoke. And we have that whenever the worship is spoken about, that's what comes back again. So, for example, in verse 15, they answered Yirmiyahu, all the people who knew, Ki mekatrot nishehem leluhim achirim. Their wives, again, they translate as made offerings. It's really kind of burned spices up in smoke. And they repeat that again in verse 17. We're going to do everything we said we're going to do. Lekater limlachat hashamayim. Here they add bahaseich lanesachim, to offer libations. Not totally clear what the significance of this is, but lekater and lahaseich seem to be the terms. I wonder almost if the notion of kind of the focus on the smoke is a sense of the almost futility of this effort that the text is choosing to put into the words of the idolaters, the idolatrous Israelites or Judeans, that all it is smoke. It's ephemeral. It's not real. It's not substantive. But again, it's the term that they use, but maybe it's chosen to kind of highlight the insubstantial nature of the worship and the incorrect, misdirected nature of the worship. Going on, and we have that again in verse 21. Jeremiah replies to the people, and he says, "Et hakiter asher kitartem," the offerings you offered. He's sort of turning back to them and saying, "Look, all this is smoke." Basically, it evokes a little bit, maybe even the language of Kohelet, Havel, Havalim, Hakol, Hevel. Everything is futile. Hevel is also kind of breath. So I think there's a little bit of a sense of that. And finally, Jeremiah goes on to say, because you burned incense, it's interesting that JPS changes kitautem from offered offerings here to burned incense, vasher chatatem, and you sinned. That this kind of smoke worship is a profound sin. One of the other pieces of this chapter is kind of the power of words. What the people say when Jeremiah asks them to, stop doing the offerings that you've been offering. They say, Hadavar, verse 16, Asher dibarta eleinu b'shem Adonai einenu shomim elecha. We're not going to listen to the matter about which you spoke to us. In other words, your words have no authority or no sway over us. Rather, what we're going to do is et kol hadavar asher yatsa mipinu, everything which came out of our mouths. We're not going to listen to what came out of your mouth. And instead of saying, we're going to follow what our hearts wish, they say we're going to follow what comes out of our mouths. And that's a reference to kind of these vows that they made to offer offerings to the other, the Queen of Heaven and the other gods of Egypt. And so there's this kind of tension. It's one thing to say, Jeremiah speaks and the people don't listen, but now it's sort of they've counteracted his speech with their own speech, and their speech is the vows and promises that they've made to the other gods. And so kind of it's not just their passive non-listening, but they've actually responded with their own acts of speech, which are the commitments and pledges to the other gods. Maybe then when Jeremiah says in verse 23, because you didn't listen to the word of the Lord your God, instead you made these other pledges. Al kain karat etchem hara'a hazot. This disaster has befallen you, but the Hebrew word kara both means to happen and it also means to proclaim. So God sort of answers back with God's speech, which is the proclamation and declaration of the harm and damage which will befall the Israelites when they're in Egypt. And again, it comes back again here in verse 25. You and your wives, vatidaberna befichem, you have spoken, confirmed indeed what you said in words that you were going to do, the vows that you vowed, so go ahead and do it. Fine, this is what you said you were going to do. Go do it. Lachein shimu devar Adonai, but hear God's word. Im yihye od shmi nikra befi kol ish Yehuda. Omer Chai Adonai Elohim b'chol eretz Mitzrayim. No one is ever again going to invoke my name, saying, "As the Lord lives," right? To swear in God's name. Once you've dedicated your mouths to pledges of service to other gods, then I kind of remove from your lexicon, from your vocal cords, the capacity to again invoke my name, and that's the oath that God takes, Bishmi Hagadol, from in God's great name. So again, the answer, again, just to sort of play out this focus on speech, God has been speaking through Jeremiah. The people don't listen. Now they've gone so far as to open their own mouths and use their voices to pledge service to the gods of Egypt. And therefore, God says, I kind of withdraw my own name from your lips, and you cannot again invoke me. And the promise that God is going to carry this out is with kind of almost eagerness. I will be watchful over them to their hurt. I'm going to be kind of fastidious or diligent about carrying out this harm and not good. And this word shoked is a very important word for us. It takes us back to chapter 1 of Jeremiah, which is significant because here we are again. We're only on chapter 44, but this is really chronologically the last of Jeremiah's prophecies. So if we can find a link back to chapter 1, we create call it an envelope or an inclusio structure where the beginning and end sort of mirror themselves. So back in chapter 1, when God was training Jeremiah on prophetic technique, God would ask him, what do you see? And Jeremiah would say what Jeremiah saw, and God would teach him a message of how to interpret it. So in chapter 1, verse 11, God came to him and said, what do you see? Jeremiah said, Makel shaked ani roeh. I see a branch of an almond tree. And God said, okay, this is a visual play on words because almond is shaked. And God says, hey, tavta lirot, you saw correctly. Ki shoked ani al divari la'asoto. I am watchful. And here the notion is because the almond is usually the first to blossom, it's suggestive of kind of moving quickly and attending to one's promises. So I'm watchful to bring forth what I said I was going to do. So that's the term shaked, almond, and shoked, diligently, watchfully fulfilling God's promise. And that's exactly what we see here in verse 27 of chapter 44, coming to the very end of the chronology of the book. Hineni shoked alehem l'ra'a v'lo l'tova. I'm going to be watchful and attentive to carry out the punishment of the Israelites, the Judeans in the land of Egypt, ad kelotam, until they cease to be. And now, as we saw already earlier in the chapter, whenever God promises destruction, God always walks it back a step. So right after saying ad kelotam, until their complete destruction, then God still says, uplitei cherev yeshuvun, a few survivors of the sword will return. The remnant of Judah who return will learn dvar mi yakum, whose word is going to be fulfilled, their pledges to worship idols or my pledge to kind of hold them accountable. God's word ultimately will reign, and the sign will be that God is going to deliver Paro Chofra into the hands of his enemies, which ultimately does come to pass. So that's the heavy chapter 44. I think we see this notion of the service of the other gods as particularly focused on the language of smoke, maybe a kind of a criticism of it as ephemeral and insignificant, and then the movement back and forth, the interplay around do we heed the speech of God? What do we use our own speech for? And God's reaction of kind of withdrawing the capacity to invoke God's name from the people who have used their mouths to pledge worship of other gods. That takes us to chapter 45, and it's very, very brief. So let's see. Estelle, will you read it for us?
The word which the prophet Jeremiah spoke to Baruch, son of Neriah, when he was writing these words in the scroll at Jeremiah's dictation in the 4th year of King Jehoiakim, son of Josiah of Judah. Thus said the Lord, the God of Israel, concerning you, Baruch. You say, woe is me, the Lord has added grief to my pain. I am worn out with groaning, and I have found no rest. Thus shall you speak to him. Thus said the Lord, I am going to overthrow what I have built and uproot what I have planted. This applies to the whole land. And do you expect great things for yourself? Don't expect them, for I am going to bring disaster upon all flesh, declares the Lord. but I will at least grant you your life in all the places where you may go.
Okay.
Um,
So what's that, Estelle?
no, the rest is hidden.
Yes, that's the end of the chapter. It's a very
Oh,
brief one. And I'll just
wow.
take a moment to summarize and understand what's going on here. So this is the word which Jeremiah said to Baruch ben Neriah, who was his scribe, his faithful scribe. He was writing these words in a scroll at Jeremiah's dictation, and we have
That's
the timestamp,
terrible.
the 4th year of King Jehoiakim, son of Josiah of Judah. So we'll go to our king list for a moment. Let's see if it'll load up. Yeah, King Jehoiakim, son of Josiah, starts ruling in 609. If it's the 4th year of his reign, that takes us to 605. So it's 605. Now remember, we just read of the destruction of the temple and the people over these last 5 chapters, the remnant of Judea has gone down to Egypt, and some time has passed. That destruction was in 586. Maybe it's 580, just speculating. So we've now jumped back minimum 20, but maybe even 25 years or more for this final little prophecy. And the question is, why? So a couple of things we notice already. First of all, the prophecy is directed to Jeremiah's scribe. So one possibility is simply when you're compiling a book of prophecies, you organize it along the lines of its recipients, right? How would one organize it? This book is called Jeremiah. It is the collection of Jeremiah's prophecies. So how should you organize it? Well, a simple organizing principle is chronological. Just list all the record and write all the prophecies in the order in which they were received. That's one approach. But then, given that prophets speak to different people over time, it could feel choppy or disjointed. Yes, we have it in chronological order, but if Jeremiah had 3 prophecies that he delivered in the temple gate, or 3 prophecies that he delivered to the Benjaminites, and in order to get to them, you have to wait till they pop up in chronological order, you miss something thematic. The one possibility is organize it by recipient. The prophecies that were delivered to one group are all clustered. Prophecies that are delivered to the next group are clustered. In a loosest sense, that's how the book is organized. The first 44 chapters are the prophecies to Judah and Jerusalem. The next chapter, chapter 45, is the prophecy to one person, which is Jeremiah's scribe. We're then going to see chapter 46 begins the word of the Lord to the prophet Jeremiah concerning the nations. We have a chapter about Egypt, and then we're going to have chapters after that about the Philistines, and we're going to have a chapter after that about Moab. So we don't know the chronology of when those different prophecies were given, but we can see that maybe the book is actually just organized by recipient, and maybe it's even sort of moving as we move through the national ones to other nations. We'll ask about the organizing principle, within that. How do you decide if Jeremiah offers prophecies to 5 different foreign nations? How do you decide how to order those? Does it have to do with from ally to enemy? Does it have to do with geographic arrangement of the other nations? But certainly the fact that we finished the destruction of the temple, we're about to begin the prophecies to the other nations, and now we have this single prophecy to Jeremiah's scribe, suggests to us that organizing by recipient might be an organizing principle of the book. But we have to not just, hang on one second, Estelle, let's not be satisfied with that. Let's also think for a moment about the placement here and the content. So the message of the prophecy is fascinating, right? The message is, this is a prophecy for your scribe Baruch. And first it begins with a kind of God reflecting and repeating Baruch's comments. What does Baruch say? Baruch says, woe is me, oy nali. The Lord has added grief to my pain. I am worn out with groaning, and I have found no rest. That's all we know about what Baruch says. Baruch is complaining. Now, why is Baruch complaining? Is this a personal complaint? Is this a national complaint? Is this someone who's saying, it's been my job to follow Jeremiah around all these years as his scribe, and now we've seen, this is not the destruction of the temple, this is 20 years earlier, but we've already seen the recalcitrant stubbornness of the people. It's exceedingly painful, and it's just hard to go on with this work. Or maybe it's a personal comment. Baruch has some personal suffering that he's going through. We don't know for sure, but we know that he's suffering for some reason in some way. And God's message, harsh though it may be, is kind of broaden your perspective, right? When God ends that kol haaretz hi, this applies to the whole land. So you have to minimize, Baruch, you have a job to do. You have to kind of adjust your expectations about yourself, or maybe even about what's realistic for the people. Know that, I will protect your life, but, difficult things are ahead. In a sense, it mirrors what we saw in chapter 1, where God tells Jeremiah, you have difficult things ahead of you, difficult messages to deliver. But God says, gird up your loins, go speak to the people and tell them everything I command you. And I'm making you this day a fortified city, an iron pillar. People will attack you, but not overcome you. So maybe in a sense, that was the message for Jeremiah. Then we go through the chronological history, not precisely, but we go through the history of Jeremiah's prophecies. And then at the end, we kind of come back and say, wow, even Jeremiah's scribe, Baruch, it's hard. This is tough. This is difficult work. And he gets the same message that Jeremiah gets at the beginning, which is, hang in there. You will survive to deliver your message, even though you will bear witness to a lot of very difficult things. One more note about how this links up with chapter 1, which is verse 4, when God says, I'm going to overthrow what I have built and uproot what I have planted. This again takes us back to chapter 1, where Jeremiah's central prophetic mission was summarized in one verse. I appoint you this day over nations and kingdoms, to uproot and pull down, to destroy and to overthrow, to build and plant. Lintosh v'lintot, lahavid v'laharos, livnot v'lintoa. And there, the order was destruction and then rebuilding, right? Yes, you're going to have a lot of prophecies of destruction, but there are also prophecies of rebuilding. Here, it's a little bit overturned. Here, God is saying, I'm going to destroy what I have built, and I'm going to uproot what I have planted. So there's a kind of a somber, sober description there. But when we read this and we remember that this is 20 to 25 years before the destruction of the temple, maybe we can actually take a little comfort and say, there, God was uprooting what God had built. But if we go back to Jeremiah's first prophecy, then we know that even after that destruction, there will yet be rebuilding. So maybe it's there to kind of take us back almost to the halfway point of Jeremiah's career and say, yes, more devastation comes, but the messengers are protected, and the ultimate rebuilding will follow. I just will share one last thing, and then we'll open it up for comments. There's a fascinating midrash, which gives another take on what Baruch was saying. It's in the Mechilta, and if Safaria is ready to open it for us, I will share it with you. Hold on. Okay. Thus do you find with Baruch ben Neriah, who complained before the Lord. What did he say? Verse 3 of our chapter. Baruch says, woe unto me, the Lord has added grief to my pain. And God sort of, the Midrash or God says, what is the meaning of this comment? The comment is, Manishtaneti. We hear almost the Passover, Manishtana. Manishtaneti ani mikol talmidei hanaviyim. Why am I different from all the disciples of the prophets? Yoshua shimesh et Moshe v'sharat alav ruach hakodesh. Elisha shimesh et Eliyahu v'sharat alav ruach hakodesh. Joshua was Moses's scribe, assistant, second in command, and then he got to succeed him, and God's spirit rested on him, and he became the leader of the Jewish people. Elisha served Eliyahu as his messenger, assistant, and then the spirit of God rested on him, and he became the leader of the Jewish people. Here I am, I've served Jeremiah faithfully, and all I do is be a scribe. I never get the spirit of God to rest on me, and I never get to lead. That's what The Midrash is imagining Baruch is saying when he says, "The Lord has added grief to my pain. I have the pain of having to deliver these terrible prophecies, and I have the grief of never actually even getting to be the leader who, who supports the people or guides the people." In part, this reading, I think, is based on the fact that the very last verse, God says, "Do you expect great things for yourself?" Right? So clearly, God is understanding, and the Midrash is understanding that what Baruch is complaining about, in a sense, is that he never gets to be the number one prophet, which again is not necessarily just about self-promotion, but about that special connection with God and the special connection with the people. And so how does God answer him? What I have built and I'm going to destroy. What I have planted, I'm going to uproot. And you are seeking great things for yourself, meaning there's no opportunity to serve, because the destruction is coming, and the temple is ultimately going to be destroyed. There's kind of not a next step here, in a sense, almost just sort of saying, it's not that you're unworthy, it's that you were in the wrong place at the wrong time. This is not an era in which there is going to be a new prophet being endowed with the Spirit of God. And this sort of combo helps us note what some of the commentaries here pointed out, which is we're actually at a kind of a watershed moment now. We're really nearing the end of prophecy altogether. We have Ezekiel in the exile, but we're nearing the end of prophecy altogether. And we're also sort of transitioning to the time of writing, right? The end of prophecy, in a sense, coincides with the end of, the oral tradition, in a sense, and we're moving towards writing. So there's this sort of transition to the scribe. So there's a lot that's going on in this chapter, with sort of seeing things. We've seen through Jeremiah's eyes how he experiences things. Now we're seeing through the lens of the scribe, how the scribe experiences things. We're sort of seeing the shift from national prophecy to almost a personal prophetic message, although we've certainly seen that sometimes with messages to the kings. And we're also seeing this sort of, even though we're at the midpoint, we're sort of in this chronological moment in chapter 45, we're at the midpoint of Jeremiah's career, but we're also seeing sort of links to the beginning and to the end with the placement of this chapter. So it sort of serves as a fascinating kind of coda before we move on to the prophecies about the nations. All right, I talked for a long time. Happy to hear questions and comments. I think Estelle was waiting to say something, so please.
No, I'm sorry. I just wanted to say that it seems to me that if God is talking to all these people, he's trying to cover all his bases. It's probably sacrilegious to say that, but if God feels, well, if I'm not right here, I might as well be right talking to somebody else. It's a question of more than one answer in case he's wrong. Is that possible?
That's a fascinating take. Yeah, it's a fascinating take. Kind of, although remember here that the prophecy of Baruch was still transmitted through Jeremiah. So Jeremiah still sort of is the mouthpiece, and the same with the prophecies to the other nations. So there's something to the fact that God is transmitting messages to different recipients, but the vehicle still is the same. It's not that God, again, inside the framework of Jeremiah, we don't have the sense that God is turning to other prophets, but God is certainly reaching out with messages for different people. Yeah.
Different points of view.
Yeah. Okay, Carl, please.
Okay. You raised some very, very interesting points. I think, again, this is edited, and understanding the editorship. This is done by somebody. It probably might not very well have been Yirmiyahu, is very, very important. But I mean, it deserves probably 5 lectures in and of itself to see what is the importance of editing. But if you look at Pasuk 2, and instead of saying Alecha Baruch, if you say Alecha Yirmiyahu, that makes everything completely clear. Okay, this was, I mean, Yirmiyahu had a terrible, terrible time. He really suffered being, okay, and he was told that at the beginning. He suffered halfway through. If you say, okay, he was given this prophecy, and again, to tell you, boy, it's going to be tough. The only thing I'm promising you is you'll live. And now at the end, he's about to go to Egypt with this group that has been condemned to being wiped out. And he's putting this at the end to see, this is the culmination. This, God said this to me. He's telling me now, and I still have nothing to look forward to. It's still the end. Then it makes much, much more sense if you say that this was a prophet to Yirmiyahu, not to Baruch.
Hmm.
And I think that's done several times where the object is shifted. I know in Tehillim, we say it every I think the Friday night and Shabbos, Mizmor B'Yom HaShabbat. It doesn't say you're going to see your enemies destroyed. It says you will see your enemies, and we're supposed to infer what you see. So here, it's just too painful to actually say, Yirmiyahu, it's all over for you. So we shift it a little.
Yeah,
That's a
change
really,
the point of
really
view.
fascinating take. Certainly, there's no question that the message feels appropriate and resonant for Jeremiah. So, a totally plausible take that somehow it just sort of shifted for some reason in some way, an editorial layer, or. But I think it could also precisely be the point here to, humanize the scribe and sort of say, like, the burden and the toll that prophecy took on Jeremiah in one way, we just get sort of a glimpse of another, I don't want to call it like a casualty, but another, weighty participant, which is the scribe, who is right up against all the same terrible messages, and is, that it's a different experience, being the one who hears them and has to say them from the one who has to write them down. So there's sort of something to humanizing the experience of the scribe, who's passive in a different sense, active in a different sense, and misses out on the relationship with the people in a way. So I agree with you. It's totally plausible, equally plausible for Jeremiah, but leaving it as Baruch also adds this sort of dimension of humanizing another player in the story, so to speak. Great, Graham.
Yeah. Okay. Pain is a fact, and Baruch is feeling it. He's exhausted, confused, afraid for his life. Fair enough, but suffering and grief that he's going through is a psychological choice. So even though this, it's like a sad story that Baruch is telling himself about the physical fact of a painful situation, right? So I'm trying to separate the real pain from the human story about pain. So he says, "Woe is me," right? But God is telling Baruch through Jeremiah to stop indulging in such neurotic self-involvement, to go beyond it. So he says, God is saying through Jeremiah, I need you to be strong because there's plenty of important work yet to do. Right? I mean, nobody who's in pain wants to hear this. They want to hear, stop feeling sorry for yourself, buck up, get back to work. But it's an encouragement to Baruch, without giving a lot of time for sympathy, like, oh, I understand. It's like a snap out of it moment. Like nobody wants to hear this when they're feeling what Baruch was going through.
Yeah. Interesting. And I love just pausing to really reflect on this idea of Yasaf Adonai Yagon al Mach Ovi. God has added grief to my pain. What's the relationship between pain and grief?
Right.
What are the things we have control over, and what not?
Right.
Yeah.
Grief is the story we tell ourselves about pain. Pain's real. Grief is the human story we have created around it.
Right.
But grief is psychological pain, not physical pain.
Exactly. It's separate. It's the story we tell ourselves about the real pain.
Mm-hmm.
Which
Mm-hmm.
is the real pain.
Real pain is the real pain. We tell us a lot of times we tell a story about pain and then we respond to the story. You know, we gear our actions to the story we're telling about the real fact and lose sight of the real fact of pain.
Grief helps us tolerate pain.
Mm.
Yeah, it can. I sure. You tell a positive story like, you know, it was meant to be, dear, you know, this kind of thing, or
Oh
this and that.
God, no.
Yeah, right.
Oh,
But you know what I mean? Like pain is real. Oh, I think everybody by this time has experienced some. and then the story you tell yourself about it is something entirely different.
I don't.
Nice.
It's like a soundtrack on a movie. You got the real movie and then you got the soundtrack.
Yeah. Oh no, a lot to reflect on in that notion of the relationship between ke'ev and yagon, between pain and grief. Great, great. All right. Other comments or reactions to this story of Baruch? Okay, great. So thanks for everyone for bearing with our technical challenges. I already put in a reminder to send the correct link for next week. And we will move on to chapter 46 as we begin the last section, second to last section of Jeremiah, a series of prophecies directed to other nations, which will be interesting. And then we have a little kind of historical recap at the end. So we march forward. And next week I'm returning to New York tonight, so look forward to seeing those who I'm able to see over Shabbat. And next Thursday's class will be back in person for those who can make it in person. Always great to be in the same room. And wishing a great day to everybody.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.